Hello, fellow Raxians. Today I want to talk about the flow of battle. Now you may have heard that from me before. I've actually done a series on this already. But I haven't gotten around to a video where I was able to answer some of the questions and concerns about the system. I also never really get a chance to iterate on how the construction system affects the flow of battle, so we'll dive into that as well. But hold up, there's one thing we have to cover first. I was working really hard on this video before the patch hit live. It was intended to be part of the testing phase discussion. Now that the patch is here, I would rather just be focusing on the many good aspects of it. Watching back through this, I really feel like Sir Buzz Killington. But all of my statements do still hold true, and it's all still good discussion. The timing is just terrible now that the patch is already on live. I did add a few extra interjections to my original footage, and I want to make sure we're clear on what those are, so in the bottom right of your screen I will note when it was recorded post-patch. Okay. Shall we? Many of you have probably stared at a map screen that looks like this. One faction that's hoarding all the cores, building bases far away from where most of the action is taking place. And you've got two options. You can either let yourself be forced into a style of gameplay that you don't want to do, that is flying around hive busting behind enemy lines. This has to be one of the least rewarding things you can do in PlanetSide. The amount of certs you earn is dismal because there's not a lot of stuff to kill. Sure, there might be an engineer you can pick off, but you're mostly just trying to sneak around some turrets. There's nothing fun about it. The bases are in an annoying corner of the map, and half the time you aren't playing against people. It's just kind of shields and AI modules. And your stats just get crushed. Your actions per minute, your score per minute goes way down. There's not many kills to be had, and there's an inevitable death when you take out the hive. It's just a terribly unrewarding experience all around. How about this base I found that was literally built underwater? Or this one where the only way in was crashing a Valkyrie through the sky shield, and the spawn room and hive were placed in such a way that you were lit on fire if you went anywhere near it. The other option is to just say F it, let's ignore it. Let's go play PlanetSide the way it used to be where we went out and shot people. So you go out and start dominating an alert. But in the meantime, that other faction has built up 7 cores and have mined their way to victory before you can even close out the alert. Now, Daybreak understands this, and that's why they're coming out with a critical mass update. But regarding the flow of battle, this system is a band-aid on top of a stack of band-aids. When really you need to go in and operate on the gaping hole beneath this stack of band-aids that is the meta of PlanetSide. So in the new system, you have to meet 2 conditions to trigger an alert which can lock a continent. That will be the new meta. One condition is 41% territory control. The other condition is refining 25,000 cordium. This system is still on the test server. Expect these values to change, but you get the general idea of what they're shooting for. Here's the thing. There's nothing stopping one faction from hoarding 7 hives next to the warp gate, just like they do now. And that cordium refinement is a required piece of starting the alert. So in the new system, if some faction decides to go and set up 7 hives deep within their territory, you will be required to go do hive busting in non-connected areas. And I think that's sort of their goal. Say, hey, construction is a permanent part of the meta play. You're going to have to go blow up those hives. And some people will do that. Right now, the people that are building 7 hives are also the people that are doing big max drops on top of poorly defended cores. The problem is a lot of the PlanetSide 2 community just plain old doesn't enjoy that play. So we'll run into the same issues we have right now. Those that are willing to play by the rules of the system will dominate it, and those that find dropping bases deep within enemy territory utterly boring and unfun will again just ignore the meta and just hope they can find some good fights. This idea where you're going to let functional bases pop up in places across the map where there is no battle going on destroys any concept of a macro flow. This system was effectively tried in beta, when you could attack any territory even if you didn't have any adjacency. And it just didn't work. The rules and objectives have to promote a meta play where there is a battle line, and the best way to be successful is for factions to stay engaged on that battle line and push back and forth. So going back to the hybrid hex lattice. In this system, any hive built in non-actionable territory will not be able to refine cordium for points. In this manner, we immediately eliminate 95% of the annoying bases that are built basically out of bounds. Now we also need to make sure that effective hives are only built near the battle lines. Sure, if someone wants to go play PvE and build a hive near their warp gate, that's fine, but it should do very little in terms of refining cordium. My recommendation is that a hive is 100% efficient if it is within one territory of a friendly and an enemy hex. That means it has to be right on the front line. When either of those values get higher, the efficiency goes down. If it's 2 territories away from an enemy hex, it only has 66% efficiency. If it's 3 territories away from an enemy or a friendly hex, it has 33% efficiency. And if it's 4 or more territories away from a friendly or enemy hex, it can no longer refine cordium. You'll notice it has the requirement of being near friendly and enemy territory. Because even if it's built deep within enemy territory, it's equally as awful to go fight against these bases, because they're still nowhere near the front lines in actual fun battle. Putting this requirement on it means as you move forward, the hives behind you will become less efficient. But that just means in order to maintain your refining efficiency, you need to make sure new, more forward bases are built and hives installed there. A really cool feature would be if you could actually transport a core from a hive that has lost efficiency up to the front lines. But even without that feature, the system as it stands will naturally take the core from the less efficient hive and drop it into the more efficient one. So now with a map system that has the granularity that you can actually tell where the front line is, and just by adding 2 simple rules to it, you've now made construction a functional, fun part of the meta play. AI modules, sky shields that set infantry on fire, and invulnerable walls with one-way shields are bad mechanics. But once you bring construction back to part of the actual battle flow, rather than these weird fringe bases that have to be self-sustaining when they get a gal drop, you can do a tuning pass to make the bases fun places to engage the enemy. There's one other thing the hybrid hex lattice would allow. Sometimes a base is built in a good spot. It's right on the front line, it's in between 2 important bases. But what I usually do right now is fly right over the top of it and gal drop the next base, hack out a Sunderer. There is no value in fighting at the base, so we just go for the next objective. In a hybrid hex lattice, a well-constructed base would actually have the ability to entirely keep the enemy out of the hex and halt their movement down that lattice until they were able to break through that base. I know that's worrisome to some because they've had so many crappy fights at bases. But if you can think back to when construction was launched and it was a little bit different, base fights can actually be really fun for both the attackers and defenders, and really should hold a serious place in the meta play, as long as they've been tuned properly. So we've gone over how construction would fit in the hex lattice system. I wanted to dive into some of the critiques and concerns from the community. There was a lot of good discussion surrounding this idea. There's one person that pointed out that in this system it's actually possible to capture hexes to a warp gate and cut that warp gate off without taking bases. And I realized to a lot of people it was a concern, but to me it was one of the key strengths of this system. You could allow a very coordinated group to go and secure about 20 to 30 different hexes in order to do a unique cutoff strategy. It would be nearly impossible to complete because your forces would be stretched so thin to try to maintain this blockade around a warp gate. But if you did it, it could be awesome and epic. So I really like having that extra level of strategic play. But if you wanted to just eliminate the possibility of it happening, you could just make it so that cutoff hexes don't act as influence on nearby hexes. So once your run got cut off, you couldn't actually take any more territory, and you'd have to retreat back to the front line. Malorn, a retired PS2 designer, voiced the concern that this system would create an endless game of whack-a-mole. That there would be too much surface area that people could attack, so the forces wouldn't really crash into each other. Ghost capping would go rampant, and you'd never really be able to establish good fights on any lattice. And that would be awful. That is something we want to avoid at all costs. However, if you really dive into this system, you'll see that that wouldn't be an issue at all. You would actually have the ability to decrease the width of the front line and focus where the population hits each other in between the bases. The existing lattice system kind of creates one-to-one contact. And if you want to simulate that in a hex-lattice hybrid, you just do singular hexes between the bases. And for some smaller lattices, that'll be appropriate. But that doesn't add much room for strategy, or flanking, or cutting the enemy off. In some of the bigger lanes, you can widen it out to 2 or 3 hexes, so there's some opportunity for some extra play and different strategies going down that lane. With the system as it is, the field is so meaningless that what you're watching here is the most common occurrence. A fight ends and the defenders don't bother setting up a counterattack. Because why? There's 0 point to it. They gain nothing by holding the field. So they just redeploy across the map to another fight. So the attackers are left running an uncontested convoy up to the next base. It's a good critique, but ultimately not an issue in this system. And then he made one other point, and I hope you've watched my original video so you have some context here. But this hex-lattice hybrid idea really piggybacks off this neutral hex idea by a guy named Noble. And Malorn states that lattice is just a different representation of the neutral hexes, referring back to Noble's system, that doesn't require finding awkward hex setups to join them in a desired configuration. And that's just a complete misunderstanding of both Noble's neutral hex system and my hex-lattice hybrid system. There is no shortcut to create this macro flow. You don't get to say, well, this base only gets to attack this base, so we've created flow. What these systems do that Noble and I have proposed is makes it so it's worth staying engaged with the enemy. Because now if the enemy disengages off this lane, they're not just going to lose one base and then defend at a biolab. They're going to end up losing about 10 different hexes, and that's a big chunk of territory. That's the difference in an alert, and that also takes a major bite out of your territory control, which is generated an Araxium for you, so you can go buy items on the auction house. I'm getting ahead of myself a little here. I haven't actually explained that part of my meta system, but stay tuned for that video sometime in the future. Anyways, the long and short of it is the lattice system is a shortcut to nowhere. What I am proposing is not an easy task, but we've been through 4 different iterations of the macro flow at the meta level, and each one is a band-aid on the last, and critical mass is no different. There's a point where you gotta stop and think, how many iterations have I been through? How much time and energy have I put into these temporary band-aid solutions? And what if we just pooled all that time and energy into one bigger, better solution? Sure, it'd be triple the work to implement it than any one of these systems, but you've already spent more time installing all those band-aids. Rel also had some critiques of the system that I wanted to address. He states on live, facility choke points are capable of stalling Zergs until reinforcements come in. And that is absolutely true. But that's also the reason the Zergs have to exist in the first place. The only way to get through Crossroads Watchtower, or Howling Pass Checkpoint, or Quartz Ridge Camp, is to hit it with overwhelming population. These bases are so heavily skewed in the defender's favor. And that is not a good system for macro flow. What ends up happening is factions generally ignore lanes till the attackers get near something like a biolab or a tower base, complain about the enemy faction Zerg all the way till they're there, and then show up for the epic farm while the attackers uselessly throw themselves at the base. Because the territory in between those choke points is so useless. So the attackers retaliate by massing their forces to such an extreme degree and hitting these bases so hard that the defenders can't hope to defend them. This is usually achieved through a double team, waiting until the faction with that biolab is occupied at a different tech plant or something, and then crashing the biolab so they can't respawn in time. And then you've made it to a point where you have all these 96 plus balls moving around the map, sometimes all going in different directions and never engaging each other. And we're really pushing into kind of the micro flow part of the discussion here, which is important and parallel to the macro flow, but I do address those issues in that segment, so make sure you've watched that so you're up to speed. The next big point he makes is, there's no doubt that open field fights are some of what PlanetSide 2 does best, and it does so naturally between bases. Now this is something I 100% disagree with, and I think a lot of members of the community that have spent a lot of time in leadership roles, whether it's an outfit leader or a platoon leader or server smash leaders, will agree that these awesome open field fights by no means come naturally and are not the norm. I keep a shadow play folder of the good open field fights I run into, and one that's full of examples of poor battle flow, double teaming, and the general crappiness of the existing system. The second folder is 10 times the size of the first, and I've stopped recording those moments. I still record the open field fight moments. He argues that as soon as you gamify the open field fights, you wouldn't see the back and forth. And I just don't follow that logic, because there is no back and forth right now. In this situation, we had an even fight at the last base, up until it had turned into a spawn camp, and then the enemy left. We drove up to the next base, completely uncontested, because no one bothers defending the field. And after about 15 seconds of fighting here, it had turned into a spawn camp again. Open field fights are one of the things that makes PlanetSide so awesome. But they are just too rare. Gamifying the field, that is the hex lattice, would promote these fights, would keep lanes engaged, would create battle lines, and finally help us land on a functional meta. And then his final critique was one I heard from everyone, and I understand their concerns. If you base hex ownership strictly on population, the most effective way to capture territory then is by numbers and vehicles. And the second part of that is intentional. In my system, vehicles are supposed to dominate the field fights, the real macro flow of PlanetSide, and infantry are supposed to dominate the base fights, the more micro flow of PlanetSide. Think of it like a wavelength. You have a period of vehicle, harasser, sunderer play in the field, and then that dips down to a period of infantry engagement play in the base. This system encourages players to be three-dimensional, and those that prefer one aspect of PlanetSide are usually not that far away from the type of engagement they enjoy. Rather than having to log on and say, oh, it's just a bunch of tower farms, I can't find a good harasser fight. Don't worry, aircraft, I haven't forgotten about you. It's just a little tougher to balance air because they can get into the micro and macro fights very easily. My vision for air involves controlling fleet carriers in order to exert influence on certain areas of the map, reducing capture timers based on who controls them. Again, stepping way ahead of this video. For now, they're just going to have to settle for being able to engage both the micro and the macro fights, and while they cannot actually flip the hexes or the points in the bases, they can still affect both battles just by taking out combatants on either side, be it infantry, tanks, or other aircraft. Now, to be honest, I don't really care how the hex capture happens. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You could use an influence system. You could use a system where you have to eradicate all the enemies. Whatever. The only reason I went with population is because it's simple, and it would have the same effect. Let me explain. Let's say there's 12 guys in a hex, in a mix of Sunderers and Vanguards. And a Sunderer column rolls into that hex with 24 people. Now the hex is going to start flipping in the 24-person favor. But if this is a tight-knit outfit against a bumbling Zerg, and they rapidly start dismantling this 24-man team, and are able to hold their ground in the hex, in no time, they're going to win that battle, and the hex is going to flip back in their favor. If the 24-man crew pushes them back, then naturally they will maintain the hex. So as this battle flows up and down a hex lattice, even if one side has less population, they're still going to take the hexes by naturally pushing the enemy out of them. So I understand why everyone has that knee-jerk reaction where if you base control on population, it's bad. But you have to understand in this macro flow scenario, it's not who has more population, it's who is winning the fight. And less population winning the fights will still end up taking the territory even if it's a population-based capture mechanic. Now in terms of controlling Zerging, no macro flow system will do that. The hex system won't, the lattice system won't, the hex lattice system won't. That part I cover in my third part of the series, fixing the spawn system. And the hex lattice hybrid is the system that's most equipped to aid the spawn system in judging where it should put population. A lot of people jump the gun and start pointing out, well, people are just going to Zerg the lanes. That happened in beta, that happened in the hex system, that happened in the lattice system, and that'll happen in the hex lattice system if you don't address the spawn system. So I understand your concerns there. That just has to be discussed regarding the spawn system, which again is parallel to the micro and macro flow, but something different. With such a complex topic, it's good to set some variables aside so you can solve certain aspects of the meta play, and then discuss those variables in their own right so you can solve those aspects of the meta play. If any of the variables are ignored, the whole system will collapse. And there is certainly plenty of discussion to be had on the micro flow of battle and my suggested spawn system. But since the proposed critical mass system doesn't address those at all, I'm not really going to revisit those at this time, even though they are imperative to any adjustments to the meta play. Probably even more so than the actual macro flow of battles. Okay, that brings us up to speed on the most notable critiques of the hybrid hex lattice. So now I want to jump forward into the system that's going to be introduced critical mass. To no one's surprise, the test was a complete disaster of double teaming. There were absolutely some extra variables introduced. In this system, the TR would never have triggered an alert because they were completely ignoring construction. So they were hours away from ever having the refined coordinating requirements to actually make an alert start. But in order to get the test moving forward, Daybreak triggered the alert for the faction that was in the lead in terms of territory control. And since TR was ignoring construction and they had the Northern Warp Gate, understandably they had the most territory. Even though they were tied with the NC for lowest population, and VS was ahead of them by 9%. And then on top of that, the alert broadcast message announced that people should destroy the TR, further encouraging people to initiate a double team. Now everyone's been there before. Even though everyone seems to claim it's always one faction that's on the short end of the stick of the double team, that's inaccurate. Every faction takes their turn getting screwed over. And it's a terrible experience, whether you have 22% world population or you have 42% world population. It just sucks the will to fight, the will to stay logged in right out of you. The fights are always uneven, so the enemy's driving directly to your warp gate and getting spawn camps way too quickly. And then the worst part about it is so the other two factions grind you into your warp gate, you've lost your lead, you've lost the bases that are good to defend, and then they just disappear and go fight amongst themselves. So the event of recovering all that territory is usually a boring ghost cap, while you try to dig yourself out of 15 or 20% territory control. In the cards section, I'm going to be linking some footage of getting double teamed. I don't recommend watching it. It's boring, awful footage. I just want to back up my statements. If you did glance through it, you'll notice there's a lot of footage where the TR has 38%, 41% world pop, and they still end up getting slammed back into their warp gate. Because when you're getting double teamed, you're effectively going up against 60 to 65% world population. Your 41% world pop means jack shit then. For the second test, the TR again triggered the alert, in spite of the devs trying to give the VS and the NC a heads up they were about to do so. This time the Terran Republic did have the population advantage, but that didn't matter for a couple reasons. Part of the TR force decided to push really deep into the VS territory, almost touching Quauti Amp, goading the VS into putting all their resources on the TR. And after that, it was a double team for the rest of the alert. And then the final test was a 30-minute alert set on Hossin. Now the NC triggered and won this alert, which I think is what motivated the devs to shift the alert time to 30 minutes, because it was the only alert the triggering faction won. Now you're going to notice a conversation pop up on my screen here. Even though the NC had triggered the alert, the TR was still getting double teamed. So I ran down to a VS base to ask why. And I shouldn't have been surprised, but it was because a notorious outfit leader on Connery was part of the alert. Now this guy has become the bane of everyone's existence because he loves construction. And that's fine, play PlanetSide how you want to. Unfortunately, no one else on our server enjoys it. So we constantly end up with these situations where VS have 7 cores, because they're the only ones that are really willing to participate in construction. Now this guy took offense to the fact that the devs weren't letting construction trigger the alerts like it would on live. And since there were only about 100 people per faction on the test server, his 2 to 3 squads amounted to a pretty large percentage of the force. So he went ahead and threw the final NC alert by double teaming the TR even though they didn't trigger the alert. So the NC easily maintained 36% territory control and won the alert. And the test server is great and all, but that's the reason the devs had to push it to live. The test server is just full of extremes. It has the tryhard group that's going to do exactly what the devs say. When they say double team the TR, they're going to do it. Or it's going to have these other people that have another idea in their mind that the devs are somehow screwing them over. So they're going to go try to completely mess up the test. The only place you can really get accurate data is on live, where there are a bunch of groups that are really trying at the alert and a whole bunch of other people that don't even know what an alert is. Guys, my bread and butter is leading platoons. That's what I love to do. So I am biased to making sure there is really interesting, fun, intricate battle flow. But there are so many different types of population in PlanetSide. Some just want to drive or harass around. Some like flying a lib. Some people are just solo players that don't really care about what the map looks like, they just want to find a good fight. And the devs understood that construction in the VP system was cutting into everyone's fun. And so they went and solved this really big problem of these very sudden locks. And long overdue, they finally added some rewards. And even if there's not a lot of strategic depth in the flow on the maps, just having a reward is going to make everyone take those alerts a lot more seriously. So there is so much good about this patch, and you should absolutely enjoy the heck out of it. But I'm going to speak for a second to that group like me that really enjoys leading. Whether it's leading your outfit into battle or leading those open platoons, I think a lot of you, like me, hung up your commander's helmet a while back. I find that my actions as a leader don't have enough impact on the battlefield to make the experience enjoyable anymore. So I end up doing what a lot of veteran players do. Hang up that let's play the objective helmet and put on my let's farm directives, the weeb helmet, KDR, at pointless fights helmet. I just wanted to make sure that if there are any other leaders out there and they feel that itch has just kind of faded away and they're not sure why, at launch, the new shininess, the massive number of players, and the promise for the future made up the difference, but it's long since faded. No, you're not the only one. For now, let's let this patch play out for a little bit, and hopefully very soon, we can start discussing how to fix the meta of PlanetSide. Okay guys, you made it. That was a marathon. This is the end. For those that hung in here this long, I've got a little treat for you. This was submitted by a viewer, Infills, who on the test server took it upon himself to get on top of a Bastion fleet carrier to satisfy everyone's morbid curiosity. Yes, it's possible, but no, not while you still have a connection to the server. Thanks for watching. Check the description for ways to support the channel, and I will see you PlanetSide.